I was first acquainted with him before I actually came to Alberta. I had one trip to Edmonton to meet with Ivan Rudnytsky, who was a prospective thesis supervisor. I just finished my bachelor's degree at the time. And, I was introduced to Dr. Lupul in his office, and, the Institute had been founded about 2 years by then. This was 78, and I eventually decided to move to Edmonton and ended up doing a master's degree because, of course, the Canadian system was different from the British one, where we don't really bother very much with master's degrees. And so I actually did my master's degree in Alberta, went back to England for the PhD. But I got a job, my first ever job was with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. And at that time, of course, it was in its infancy, and Lupul was gathering younger scholars at the time, really. He was sort of creating a team. And so I stayed there for 4 years as a full-time employee on minimal wages, I would say. I mean, I was an editorial assistant. That was my official title. And Lupul was a very stern supervisor, very rigorous, very strong opinions on language. And, I kind of got to know him from that time. And eventually I got to like him a lot. I mean, I was very wary of him at first, and he didn't want to get in the way of me if he was in a bad mood, which could be something as simple as a comma in the wrong place, in some article or a newsletter or something like that. So his temper was quite legendary. But, if you go back to the founding of CIUS, I think probably this is one of the ways he'll be remembered, that and the work he did for multiculturalism and bilingual education in Alberta. And Manoly was a little different from the traditional scholar. I mean, he'd been to Harvard, he got a PhD from Harvard, but he started out, in a small village in the eastern part of Alberta, and rose really from nothing. I mean, he got his way through first of all, he did history and political science, and then when he got to Harvard, he did education, and that became his sort of passion, how to educate people on a very liberal sort of model, based on the work of John Dewey, I would say, sort of very democratic, open style of education. And he didn't really become, let's say, a Ukrainian per se. I mean, he was a Canadian of Ukrainian ancestry, as he always said, but he wasn't really much of a Ukrainian in that he didn't speak the language, he didn't write the language, he couldn't read it. But then he had a trip to Ukraine with his family, and that opened his eyes to the Soviet system. And after that, he became very much concerned with how Ukrainians were living both in the Soviet Union and in Alberta. And he was driven. He was a driven man. I mean, he was someone who really then wanted to establish a greater role for Ukrainians in Canada, but also to be recognized, as an integral part of Canadian heritage. And I think he always remained a very strong Canadian. And I think in that there's a contrast with some of the people with whom he worked in his career, who were more sort of academics concerned with what was happening in Europe. I would say then, he relied on not only his personal contacts and persuasiveness, but also the people. He had a number of people around him who helped him at the right moment. And he had contacts with the Alberta government through Bert Hohol, who I think was the treasurer at the time. Also Peter Savern, another major figure in the community, who also passed away quite recently. And they started pushing for an Institute of Ukrainian Studies. But, I was reading through his memoirs over the weekend, and it seems to me that it was never self-evident that the Institute would be in Edmonton. There was a strong push that it should be in Toronto, but there were also calls for it to be in Winnipeg and even Saskatoon. But it ended up in Edmonton as a kind of compromise, I think, with a branch in Toronto where George Rudnytsky, who was a major literary scholar, would be sort of running the section there, and then it was up in the air who who would direct the Edmonton Center. And all this coincided with the arrival of Ivan Rudnytsky to Edmonton in the early 70s, and his hiring at the University of Alberta, which again had Lupul had a lot to do with. He was pushing for it very strongly. The community had to come up with some of the funds for that, and Lupul was the one who really pushed for these funds. He worked very strongly within the Ukrainian, sorry, I'm looking down because I want to get the title right, Professional and Business Federation, and became known as the P's and B's. But also a number of other organizations as well. So Rudnytsky was also considered a candidate to be the first director. But personality seemed to play a big role in the late 1970s, and Lupul and Rudnytsky didn't get along very well. Rudnytsky's memoirs make that quite clear. Lupul's memoirs, it seems to be more concerned about Rudnytsky's wife, Alexandra. The two of them had an argument, apparently, and it eventually severed relations. But Manoly wrote in his memoirs that there are sort of two types of figures. There are the people who have their feet on the ground. They're academics, but they want to do a lot of activity within academia and push the Ukrainian cause. Whereas Rudnytsky was more, in Lupul's view, as an ivory tower academic who really was more concerned with research and didn't have much administrative ability. And that may have been true. I mean, I certainly think there was a big grain of truth in that. So eventually, Lupul became the director, Rudnytsky became the associate director in Edmonton, Rudnytsky became the associate director in Toronto, and it stayed that way for about 3 years, after which Rudnytsky left the institute and just taught part-time full-time as a professor in the Department of History. Rudnytsky remained there for another, I think it was 4 years, and then in 1983 he stepped down as well, which left Lupul as the sole director. But by that time, he was also working closely with Danylo, Struk, and a number of other figures like Roman Senkus and people in Toronto. So he remained the director for 10 years, and I think he would have said the main achievement was the appearance of the Encyclopedia of Ukraine, which was the first big project of CIUS, and certainly a long-lasting one. But also the publications in general, Lupul took a very strong personal interest in them, and used to look at them for mistakes. He would find a mistake, even if you'd edited it 10 times, he could find something wrong with it. He would look very carefully. But it was a congenial kind of atmosphere between 80 and 84. It was more like a group of friends rather than a business type operation. Lupul would come into work around 10:30, very rarely earlier than that, but he would stay long after everybody else had left. This is how he worked these kind of hours. But he was also a very social person as well. So that's kind of an introduction to, my association with him. In terms of multiculturalism, this was really something he pushed very strongly, and it did coincide with where the government of Canada and the provincial government were going at the same time. Lupul had little time for, let's say, association of ethnic background with, say, state activities. In other words, his multiculturalism was an open one. He didn't think religion, for example, should merge with the state activities. And he didn't really get along too well with the French Canadians, who he felt were pushing their cause too strongly. But it succeeded. I mean, I think the multicultural policy of Alberta is basically the one that Lupul was pushing for years, and finally got it into place. It didn't last because ultimately the bilingualism took precedence over the multiculturalism. And at the end of his book, Lupul expressed sort of regret at the way some of the groups coming into Canada saw multiculturalism, which he felt was more like ghettoism, getting into their own societies, but not really helping the Canadian cause very much. And this was a big concern to him. I mean, he was a patriot first and foremost. And so he published a book on education in the Northwest Territories, He edited several books. He edited one called Visible Symbols with Francis Swareeper. But his role was not so much as a scholar, but as someone supervising scholarly publications about Ukraine. So I think you have to consider the entire output of CIUS, what became known as CIUS Press, over the entire period of his directorship and even beyond, because he was the one who started it in motion. And that really is his contribution, that he put Ukrainian Canadians on the map. But in many ways, he also put Ukraine on the map in Canada. I mean, he was dealing with the fact that at Harvard there was already a Ukrainian research institute in place, but he often felt that Harvard was more esoteric in terms of its publications, whereas he was going to go back to the beginning, how Ukrainians came to Canada, how they were received, and all the various facets of Ukrainian life in Canada. And he did that very well. I mean, I think even today, you read those works and they feel quite contemporary, and there's still a lot of contemporary interest in those sort of topics. He became, he learned the language eventually. I'd said that he couldn't read it, but he learned to read it and he learned to speak it. I mean, he was never very fluent, but he did learn to speak it, and he could communicate, I think, through his lectures more than he could through his writing. I mean, he wasn't a fluent, articulate type of speaker. He would stutter and stammer, but the impact was enormous. I mean, any kind of speech he made had an impact on the audience, without exception, the ones that I saw. I mean, he was a very prominent figure in the Canadian Consultative Council on Multiculturalism. He was the provincial leader, basically, in the Western Canada for quite a while. He was getting various types of recognition, but I still think that CIUS was his baby. I mean, that's what he created, basically, with a couple of other people, and he was anxious that it be recognized as a scholarly institution, even though the community had played a role. He was quite critical of a number of community leaders and a number of community organizations, such as, it wasn't called the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. I think it was Ukrainian Canadian Council at that time. I mean, he's got several critical remarks. Also, the Ukrainian Civil Liberties Association comes in for some criticism in his book as well. He found it difficult, I think, to work with certain people, and he never, ever minced his words. If he thought something was stupid, he would say it was stupid. And because of that, I think he did have a number of rifts throughout his career, most notably with the appointment of Bob Magocsi as the chair of Ukrainian Studies. I mean, Lupul was writing letters opposing that, along with several other people, and later withdrew some of them, I think. He certainly was involved in the Toronto one. I mean, he was very much an influential figure in dealing with the people in Toronto. And it's difficult now, I wasn't part of that, so I was actually, I think, just finishing my MA at the time when all that was going off. But it certainly seems to have caused a nasty aftermath that's gone on for some time. And he was very much involved in that. And yet locally in Edmonton, you didn't see such an authoritarian type figure. He was more one who let people do what they want, providing that they were doing it well. And gave a great deal of freedom to his staff to pursue their careers, to publish, to give talks. And then Krawchenko, who succeeded him, did exactly the same thing, and that's why I think it was a successful operation in that period, where everybody could do what they wanted, but he had a good team, and the team got along well with him. So, but yeah, I didn't see any ambitions beyond that. I mean, he got the Order of Canada. I mean, it's the highest award we give, and I think that was to recognize his lifelong contribution to multiculturalism. I mean, he was very interested in education, which was his field, and the bilingual program in Alberta owes a lot to him and his personal leadership, even though, as I said before, he was not a fluent speaker. So I would say that was first and foremost. I mean, the output of CIUS was focused a lot on history, but that may be just the people he had in place. There are a large number of historians, but initially there were also, sociologists, Roman Patrician, language experts like Alenka Bilash, I mean, all those people were incorporated. So it was a very broad vision of CIUS. It was not sort of something narrow within only one area of humanities, for example. So I think that's where he was looking, and he was disillusioned, I think, ultimately, when he showed up for the 40th anniversary conference in Edmonton. The fact that there was not much renewal. In other words, you don't really had a lot of young people who were coming in to take over these positions and develop Ukrainian studies, and the university was cancelling Ukrainian language programs like right, left, and center. So what started as something really progressive and really, I would say, an atmosphere of great hope in the early years. By the early 2000s, let's say, there was a lot of disillusionment. A lack of funds, cancellation of programs, people retiring and not being replaced. So I was a little upset, I think, to put it mildly. And yet, if you look at the input of graduate students, for example, coming to us from Ukraine, it's phenomenal. I mean, we are probably the second biggest place outside Ukraine for grad students coming in and getting through the system. So, I mean, the young people are around, and there are a lot of young people in Edmonton from Ukraine who've come quite recently. And, it's kind of up to them or up to the Institute to attract these people as well. I mean, I completely agree with that statement. And if you just simply look at one of those videotapes, it does look like, the House of Lords in Britain or something in a late night assembly. But I'm convinced that the younger people are there. It's just a matter of getting them interested. I've not taught 20th century Ukraine over the past 3 years, but I taught 20th century Russia. And the class filled up instantly last term with 60 people, which is the highest I've ever had. And there were many Ukrainian names among the students, which suggests to me there's an awful lot of interest in Ukraine today because obviously, I mean, there's so many things happening in Ukraine, and it's aroused world interest. So it's there. I mean, I just think it's a matter of getting people attracted to what is taking place there. I mean, in many ways, perhaps he's seen as a provincial figure rather than a national one. I mean, he really lived his life in Western Canada and in Alberta. So it's logical, I think, that he's a much bigger figure here than Danylo Struk, for example. So it works in reverse as well. But he truly thought on a national scale. I mean, I wouldn't go beyond that. I wouldn't say he really thought on a world scale, but he was devoted to Ukraine. And he had a vision, he pushed it through, and he was successful. And not many people can say that about their careers. And he was an academic who was also an activist. He was not a nationalist in any way, shape, or form, but he was an activist. And that, I think, marks him out from most other people. And it's really what is needed today, someone who works with the public at the same time as being a committed academic. I would say he sacrificed his own career to that of pushing Ukrainian studies through the Institute and pushing multiculturalism as a national policy. I mean, they were the two things for which he's known and for which he's recognized. But I would like to say, in final remarks, he was a very kind man, very considerate, very kind, and he looked after his little group. And everybody in that group remained intensely loyal to him. Even today, 30, 40 years later, that loyalty has not really wavered at all. And that in itself, I think, speaks for his character and his personality underneath this very irascible, cantankerous guy who would, blow a top at the slightest thing. You had to get below that to know him properly, and I think we did. We got to know that side of him as well. A wonderful family, devoted to his wife. I mean, they were very rarely apart on social occasions, and he lived a very full life. And I think all credit to him.